The Senate Banking Committee hearing room fell dead silent as Tim Scott leaned into his microphone, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. Representative Crockett, you talk about helping communities, but what have you actually done besides make noise on social media? The attack was swift, calculated, and designed to embarrass the Texas Democrat in front of millions watching C-SPAN. But what happened next would shock everyone in that room. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't look down. Instead, she smiled the kind of smile that makes opponents nervous. Because what Tim Scott didn't know was that Crockett had been waiting for this exact moment. She had receipts, she had facts, and she was about to deliver a response that would leave the South Carolina senator completely speechless and trending on every social media platform within minutes. This wasn't just another political disagreement. This was about to become an epic takedown that would define both of their careers and show America exactly what happens when preparation meets opportunity. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss these amazing political moments. Seriously, you won't want to miss what happens next because this is about to get absolutely wild. Now let's see how Jasmine Crockett turned the tables on Tim Scott in the most spectacular way possible. The stage was set for what would become one of the most talked about exchanges in recent political history. Senator Tim Scott, sitting confidently behind his nameplate, thought he had found an easy target in the first-term representative from Texas. But he was about to learn that underestimating Jasmine Crockett was the biggest mistake of his political career. The irony was thick in the air. Here was Scott, a man who had spent years positioning himself as the reasonable voice of conservative black politics, about to get schooled by a woman who had actually spent her life fighting in the trenches for justice. The contrast couldn't have been more perfect, the establishment politician versus the street-smart attorney, the careful moderate versus the unapologetic progressive, the senator who played it safe versus the representative who came to fight. The hearing had been routine until that moment. Discussions about banking regulations, committee business, the usual Washington back and forth. But tension had been building between Scott and Crockett for weeks over their different approaches to economic policy affecting black communities. Scott, as the highest-ranking black Republican in the Senate, often clashed with progressive Democrats like Crockett over solutions to systemic issues. The backstory made this confrontation even more explosive. Just 2 weeks earlier, Crockett had called out Scott's voting record during a CNN interview, noting that he had voted against every major piece of legislation that would have directly helped black families. Scott's team had been furious, issuing press releases and demanding retractions. But Crockett had doubled down, providing receipts for every claim she made. The tension had been simmering ever since, with both sides waiting for the right moment to settle the score. What made this confrontation so explosive was that it came completely out of nowhere. Crockett had been quietly taking notes, listening to testimony, when Scott decided to make her his target. The cameras were rolling, C-SPAN was broadcasting live, and social media was about to explode. To understand why this moment was so significant, you need to know exactly who these two political figures are and what they represent in American politics today. Tim Scott had been riding high in Republican circles. As the only black Republican senator, he carried enormous weight in the party. Born in North Charleston, South Carolina, Scott had built his career on a message of conservative values and personal responsibility. He'd served in the House before moving to the Senate in 2013, and had even made a brief run for president in 2024 before dropping out. Scott's political brand was built on being the reasonable, conservative voice, someone who could speak to issues affecting black Americans while maintaining strict Republican principles. He was polished, experienced, and used to being the only black face in Republican leadership meetings. His supporters saw him as proof that the Republican Party was inclusive and forward-thinking, but critics argued that Scott often served as political cover for policies that hurt the very communities he claimed to represent. They said he was more interested in appealing to white conservative voters than actually fighting for black Americans. This tension had been building for months, as Scott positioned himself as a countervoice to progressive Democrats. The truth was, Scott had become comfortable in his role as the GOP's go-to black voice. He'd grown used to deference from colleagues, respect from conservative media, and the assumption that his perspective would go unchallenged. He'd participated in countless debates where his identity gave him automatic credibility on racial issues, regardless of his actual positions. This comfort had made him overconfident, perhaps even arrogant, about his ability to handle any challenger who might question his approach. On the other side sat Jasmine Crockett, and she represented everything that made establishment politicians nervous. A former criminal defense attorney from Dallas, Crockett had been elected to Congress in 2022 as part of a new wave of young, progressive Democrats who weren't interested in playing by the old rules. At just 42 years old, Crockett had already made a name for herself as someone who didn't back down from fights. She'd gone viral multiple times for her sharp questioning during committee hearings and her ability to break down complex issues in ways that regular people could understand. Her background as a defense attorney had taught her how to think quickly under pressure and how to dismantle weak arguments piece by piece. Crockett represented a district that was majority black and Hispanic, and she'd won her seat by promising to be an unapologetic advocate for working families. She wasn't interested in compromise for the sake of compromise, and she especially wasn't interested in being lectured by Republicans about what was best for her community. What made her particularly dangerous to opponents was her combination of legal training, social media savvy, and genuine connection to the people she represented. Unlike many politicians who seemed disconnected from real struggles, Crockett had grown up in South Dallas and understood poverty, discrimination, and the challenges facing working families firsthand. Crockett had a reputation for doing her homework. Her staff was known for preparing extensive briefing books for every hearing, every meeting, every appearance. She understood that as a black woman in Congress, she would be held to a higher standard than her colleagues, so she made sure she was always the most prepared person in the room. This wasn't just professional pride, it was survival strategy in an institution that was still dominated by white men who were often looking for reasons to dismiss her. This confrontation represented much more than two politicians disagreeing. It was about competing visions for how black Americans should engage with the political system. Scott represented the conservative approach, work within existing systems, focus on personal responsibility, don't rock the boat too much. Crockett represented the progressive approach, challenge the system directly, demand structural changes, and never apologize for fighting hard. The hearing room was packed with staffers, lobbyists, and reporters who sensed that something big was about to happen. Social media was already buzzing with anticipation as clips from earlier in the hearing showed tension building between the two. For Scott, this was supposed to be an easy win. Attack the freshman Democrat, show his conservative credentials, maybe get some clips that would play well with his base. He had the advantage of experience, seniority, and the respect that comes with being a senator. For Crockett, this was about proving that the new generation of Democrats wouldn't be intimidated by Republican attacks. She'd been dealing with condescending attitudes from male colleagues since arriving in Congress, and she was tired of being underestimated. The national political implications were huge, too. With Republicans trying to make inroads with black voters and Democrats working to energize their base, this exchange would be watched closely by political strategists on both sides. How these two leaders handled this moment could influence messaging and strategy for years to come. Adding another layer of complexity was the fact that both politicians were being watched by their respective parties for very different reasons. Republican leadership had been growing frustrated with Scott's inability to effectively counter progressive arguments about race and policy. His presidential campaign had fizzled partly because he couldn't articulate a compelling conservative vision for black America that resonated beyond traditional GOP voters. This hearing was seen as a chance for him to reassert his relevance. For Democrats, Crockett represented the future of the party, young, diverse, media-savvy, and unafraid to fight. Party leadership was curious to see how she would handle her first major confrontation with a senior Republican, especially one who shared her racial identity but held completely opposite political views. But neither Scott nor the packed hearing room was prepared for what Jasmine Crockett was about to unleash. The attack came during what should have been a routine discussion about community development financial institutions. Scott had been questioning witnesses about the effectiveness of various federal programs when he suddenly shifted his focus to Crockett, who was sitting just a few seats away from him on the committee. "You know what, Representative Crockett?" Scott said, his voice taking on a lecturing tone that immediately put everyone on edge. "I've been listening to you talk about helping communities for months now. But I have to ask, what have you actually accomplished, besides making noise on social media?" The question hit like a thunderbolt. Committee hearings rarely featured this kind of direct confrontation between members, especially across party lines. Staffers looked up from their phones. Reporters started typing frantically. The C-SPAN cameras caught every reaction in the room. Scott wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair with the confidence of someone who thought he'd just delivered a devastating blow. "I mean, I've been in Congress for over a decade. I've passed real legislation that has helped real people, but all I see from you is tweets and TikToks and viral moments. Where's the substance?" The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't just political disagreement, this was one colleague publicly questioning another's competence and seriousness. In the polite world of congressional committees, this was the equivalent of throwing a punch. Scott's tone carried all the dismissive energy of someone who believed his years in Washington automatically made him superior to the social media politician sitting across from him. What Scott didn't realize was that he was falling into a trap that had caught many politicians before him, assuming that social media engagement meant lack of substance. He was about to learn that Crockett's online presence wasn't a substitute for real work, it was an amplifier for it. Crockett's face remained perfectly calm, but anyone watching closely could see her jaw tighten slightly. She set down her pen deliberately and looked directly at Scott. The room fell completely silent, waiting for her response. But Scott wasn't done escalating. Apparently emboldened by what he saw as Crockett's silence, he decided to twist the knife deeper. "Senator Scott," interrupted the committee chairman, trying to restore order, but Scott waved him off. "No, I think this is important," Scott continued. "We have serious work to do here, and I'm tired of grandstanding. Representative Crockett, you represent a district with real problems: poverty, crime, education challenges. Your constituents deserve better than someone who's more interested in going viral than doing the hard work of governance." Now he had crossed a line that veteran politicians knew better than to cross. Questioning someone's competence was one thing, but suggesting they didn't care about their own constituents was a direct attack on their character and fitness for office. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Republican staffers were frantically texting, sensing that their boss might have overplayed his hand. Democratic staffers were equally busy, some looking worried about how their member would respond to such a public attack. Social media was already exploding. The C-SPAN clip was being shared on Twitter faster than anyone could keep track. Number Tim Scott and number Jasmine Crockett were trending within minutes, as people tried to figure out what was happening and why a Republican senator was going after a Democratic representative so aggressively. Political influencers and commentators were frantically typing hot takes. Conservative accounts were celebrating what they saw as Scott finally taking the fight to progressives. Liberal accounts were already predicting that Scott had made a huge mistake by underestimating Crockett. The comment sections were filling up with fire emojis and popcorn gifs as people settled in to watch what was clearly going to be an epic political showdown. Crockett still hadn't responded, and her silence was becoming its own story. Some observers wondered if Scott had actually succeeded in rattling her. Others who knew her better were waiting for the explosion they knew was coming. Scott, misreading her silence as victory, decided to go for what he thought would be the knockout punch. "Look, Representative Crockett, I'm not trying to be mean here. I'm just saying that if you want to be taken seriously in this institution, you need to focus on results, not social media followers. Maybe you could learn something from those of us who have actually been doing this work for a while." The patronizing tone was now unmistakable. A senior Republican senator was publicly lecturing a freshman Democratic representative about how to do her job in front of cameras during an official congressional hearing. What Scott didn't realize was that he had just given Jasmine Crockett exactly what she needed to destroy him completely. Because while he was talking, she had been quietly organizing her thoughts, pulling up information on her phone, and preparing for a response that would make this exchange legendary. The irony was perfect. Scott had just accused her of being all about social media and viral moments, while she was using her phone to access the detailed policy research and constituent services data that would prove him completely wrong. Her team had anticipated this exact type of attack, and had prepared comprehensive talking points about her actual legislative accomplishments. This wasn't luck, it was preparation meeting opportunity in the most spectacular way possible. The committee chairman tried one more time to restore order. "If we could please return to questioning the witnesses," but it was too late. Crockett was ready to speak, and when she did, everything was about to change. Jasmine Crockett finally leaned forward to her microphone, and when she spoke, her voice was steady, clear, and absolutely devastating. "Well, Senator Scott, since you asked what I've accomplished, let me tell you exactly what this freshman representative has been doing while you've been busy being the Republican Party's token black voice." The room gasped. In the polite world of congressional discourse, calling someone a token was like dropping a nuclear bomb. But Crockett was just getting started. The word choice was deliberate and devastating. By calling Scott a token, Crockett was directly challenging the foundation of his political identity and his role within the Republican Party. She was saying out loud what many black Democrats had whispered privately for years, that Scott's primary value to Republicans wasn't his policy expertise or leadership ability, but simply his race and his willingness to provide cover for policies that hurt black communities. The accusation hung in the air like a thunderclap, and everyone in the room understood they had just witnessed a moment that would define both of their careers. First, let's talk about substance since you brought it up. In my first year in Congress, I've co-sponsored 47 pieces of legislation focused on economic justice, criminal justice reform, and healthcare access. That's more than you sponsored in your first 3 years in the House. But I guess you were too busy learning how to be a good Republican to actually help people. Scott's confident smirk was already starting to fade. This wasn't the response he expected from someone he thought he could easily intimidate. But let's get specific, Senator, since you seem confused about what real work looks like. Crockett pulled out her phone and started reading from it. A move that would have seemed unprofessional from anyone else, but somehow looked perfectly natural coming from her. Last month, my office helped 847 constituents with federal agency problems, Social Security, veterans benefits, immigration issues. How many constituents did your office help last month, Senator? Do you even know? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Scott opened his mouth to respond, but Crockett wasn't finished. Oh, and since you mentioned my district's challenges, poverty, crime, education, let me tell you what I've actually done about them instead of just giving speeches about personal responsibility. What happened next was a masterclass in political destruction. Crockett began methodically listing specific accomplishments, each one delivered with surgical precision, designed to show Scott's attacks for what they really were: uninformed nonsense from someone who had stopped doing the actual work of representing people. I secured $3.2 million in federal funding for after-school programs in Dallas. I worked with local law enforcement to establish community policing initiatives that have reduced violent crime by 15% in 3 target neighborhoods. I helped pass legislation that increased Pell Grant funding, directly benefiting students at historically black colleges and universities. With each accomplishment, Scott looked smaller and smaller. He had attacked her competence, and she was systematically proving that she knew more about effective governance than he did. But here's what really bothers me about your little speech, Senator Scott. Crockett's voice took on an edge that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. You sit there and lecture me about social media and going viral, but you seem to forget that social media is how many of my constituents get their information. When I post a TikTok explaining how to apply for federal student aid, that video gets seen by 100,000 young people who might not otherwise know about those resources. She paused for effect, letting that sink in. When I tweet about a town hall meeting, I get 3 times the attendance that traditional media announcements generate. When I go viral for asking tough questions in committee hearings, it's because I'm holding powerful people accountable in ways that actually reach the people who need to see it. The room was completely silent now. Every person present understood they were watching something special, a political takedown that would be studied and replayed for years to come. But you know what really gets me, Senator? Crockett's voice dropped to almost a whisper, which somehow made her words more powerful. You have the nerve to question my commitment to my constituents when you've spent the last 5 years carrying water for a party that actively works against the interests of people who look like us. Scott tried to interrupt. Representative Crockett, I'm not finished. The steel in her voice cut him off immediately. You want to talk about accomplishments? Let's talk about your accomplishments. You've been in Congress for over a decade, and what do you have to show for it? You voted against expanding Medicaid, which would have provided health care to thousands of black families in South Carolina. You voted against raising the minimum wage. You voted against student loan forgiveness. Each you voted against hit like a hammer blow. Crockett was systematically dismantling Scott's credibility as someone who claimed to represent black interests while consistently voting against policies that would help black communities. You stood on that debate stage during your presidential run and talked about being the candidate who could bring people together. But your voting record shows you've spent your entire career dividing people by choosing party loyalty over people's lives. Scott's face was red now, clearly frustrated and looking for a way to respond, but Crockett had complete control of the moment. And then you have the audacity to sit here and question my qualifications? Crockett's voice rose slightly, not in anger, but in the kind of righteous indignation that resonates with people who have been talked down to their entire lives. Senator, I was a criminal defense attorney for years before I came to Congress. I've spent my entire career fighting for people who the system tried to throw away. I've stood in courtrooms defending people's constitutional rights while you were voting to confirm judges who would take those rights away. The personal contrast was devastating. While Scott had climbed the political ladder by appealing to conservative white voters, Crockett had spent her career actually fighting for justice in the trenches. So when you ask me what I've accomplished, here's what I've accomplished. I've never forgotten where I came from. I've never sold out my community for political gain. And I've never been so desperate for acceptance from people who don't respect me that I'd throw my own people under the bus. The final blow was delivered with such precision that several people in the room actually gasped. Crockett had just accused Tim Scott in public, on camera, of selling out his own community for political advancement. Scott finally managed to speak, his voice shaky with anger and embarrassment. Representative Crockett, that is completely inappropriate. What's inappropriate, Senator? Is a black man in your position using Republican talking points to attack a black woman who's actually doing the work? What's inappropriate is you questioning my qualifications when you've never bothered to learn what I actually do. What's inappropriate is this entire performance you just put on. Crockett leaned back in her chair, having delivered a response so complete and devastating that Scott was left speechless. The room remained silent for several long seconds as everyone processed what they had just witnessed. The committee chairman, sensing that things had gone far beyond what was appropriate for a hearing, quickly called for a recess. But it was too late. The damage was done, and the video was already going viral. The immediate aftermath of Jasmine Crockett's takedown of Tim Scott was unlike anything Washington had seen in years. Within minutes of the exchange, social media exploded with a force that surprised even seasoned political observers. The hashtag #CrockettDestroyScott was trending on Twitter within 15 minutes. The original C-SPAN clip was shared thousands of times in the first hour, with political commentators, activists, and regular citizens all weighing in on what they had just witnessed. Progressive Twitter was absolutely on fire. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, "This is what happens when you underestimate someone who actually does the work." At Jasmine 4 US just gave a masterclass in how to respond to bad faith attacks. The tweet got over 200,000 likes in 2 hours. The Shade Room posted a clip with the caption, "Auntie Jasmine said not today," that went viral on Instagram, introducing Crockett's takedown to a whole new audience of young black social media users who might not normally pay attention to congressional hearings. TikTok exploded with reaction videos. Young black women especially embraced Crockett's response, with many creating videos breaking down exactly why her comeback was so effective. One TikTok user explained, "She didn't just defend herself, she exposed his whole game. That's how you handle someone trying to come for you." Conservative social media was notably quieter, with many Republican influencers simply pretending the exchange hadn't happened. Those who did comment mostly tried to criticize Crockett's tone rather than engage with the substance of her response, which only made it more obvious that she had won the exchange decisively. Within hours, every major news outlet was covering the story. CNN ran the full exchange with the headline, "Democratic Rep delivers blistering response to GOP senator's attack." MSNBC's Joy Reid dedicated an entire segment to the exchange, calling it a perfect example of how the new generation of Democratic leaders refuses to be intimidated. Even Fox News was forced to cover the story, though they focused primarily on whether Crockett's response was appropriate for a congressional hearing. But the fact that they covered it at all showed how big the story had become. The Washington Post published an analysis piece examining the broader implications of the exchange for black political leadership. The New York Times ran a profile of Crockett, noting that she had emerged as a powerful voice for a new generation of progressive Democrats. Political podcasts couldn't get enough of the story. Pod Save America dedicated their entire episode to the exchange, with hosts Jon Favreau and Dan Pfeiffer calling it one of the most effective political responses we've ever seen. Conservative podcasts mostly ignored the story entirely, which spoke volumes about how badly it had gone for Scott. Tim Scott's team went into full damage control mode immediately after the hearing. His communications director issued a statement saying that the senator regretted that the discussion became personal and that he respected Representative Crockett's passion for her constituents. But the damage was already done. Scott appeared on Fox News the next evening, trying to reframe the exchange as an example of Democratic hostility and inability to have civil discourse. The interview was widely panned, with critics noting that Scott seemed defensive and unprepared for questions about his own voting record. Several conservative commentators who had initially supported Scott's attack began distancing themselves once they saw how thoroughly Crockett had dismantled his arguments. One prominent Republican strategist, speaking anonymously, told Politico, "Tim stepped in it big time. You can't attack someone's qualifications if you haven't done your homework on what they've actually accomplished." Scott's presidential ambitions, which were already on life support after his failed 2024 campaign, were dealt another serious blow. Political insiders noted that the exchange had revealed Scott as someone who could be easily outmaneuvered by a first-term representative, raising questions about his effectiveness as a national leader. For Jasmine Crockett, the exchange was a career-defining moment that established her as a major figure in Democratic politics. Her office reported that they received over 10,000 supportive emails in the 24 hours after the exchange, including dozens from fellow members of Congress. Nancy Pelosi tweeted her support. Jasmine Crockett represents the best of the new generation of Democratic leaders, prepared, principled, and unafraid to speak truth to power. Fundraising emails featuring clips from the exchange raised over $500,000 for Democratic candidates in just 2 days. The Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee immediately began featuring Crockett in their promotional materials, recognizing that she had become a powerful draw for donors and volunteers. Speaking invitations poured in from across the country. Within a week, Crockett had been invited to speak at over 30 events, from college campuses to Democratic Party fundraisers. Her team had to hire additional staff just to handle the media requests. The exchange between Scott and Crockett highlighted several broader trends in American politics that went far beyond just these two individuals. First, it demonstrated the growing confidence and skill of the new generation of progressive Democrats. Crockett's response showed that younger Democrats were no longer content to simply absorb Republican attacks. They were prepared to hit back hard and effectively. Second, it exposed the limitations of the Republican Party's strategy of elevating black conservatives like Scott as shields against charges of racism. When Scott attacked Crockett, he couldn't hide behind his identity. She was equally black, equally qualified, and far better prepared for the exchange. Third, it showed how social media had changed political communication. Crockett's ability to use social media effectively wasn't a liability. As Scott had suggested, it was a superpower that allowed her to reach and mobilize people in ways that traditional politicians couldn't match. Political scientists immediately began analyzing the exchange as an example of how political discourse was evolving. Dr. Melanie Price, a professor at Prairie View A&M University, noted, "What we saw was a clash between old-school political tactics and new-school political communication." Crockett understood that in the social media age, authenticity and preparation matter more than seniority and politeness. In the weeks following the exchange, several developments showed its lasting impact on both politicians' careers. Tim Scott's influence within the Republican Party noticeably diminished. He was removed from several high-profile speaking engagements, and rumors circulated that party leadership was losing confidence in his ability to effectively communicate their message. His poll numbers in South Carolina, while still strong, showed their first significant decline in years. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, was elevated to several high-profile committee assignments and became a regular on political talk shows. Democratic leadership clearly recognized that she had proven herself as someone who could effectively defend the party and its values under pressure. The exchange also had implications for how political attacks were conducted. Several Republican strategists noted privately that the Crockett-Scott exchange had shown the risks of underestimating younger Democratic politicians, especially women of color who had proven themselves in other arenas before coming to Congress. Beyond politics, the exchange became a cultural touchstone for discussions about respect, preparation, and standing up to bullies. It was shared widely in non-political spaces, with many people seeing it as an example of how to respond effectively when someone tries to diminish your accomplishments. Young black women especially embraced Crockett as a role model, with many citing her response as an example of how to handle workplace discrimination and condescension. The phrase, "I'm not finished," which Crockett used to cut off Scott's attempted interruption, became a popular meme and rallying cry. Educational institutions began using the exchange as a case study in effective communication and political strategy. Several law schools added it to their curricula as an example of how legal training could be effectively applied in political contexts. Looking back on the exchange months later, political observers agreed that it represented a significant moment in the evolution of American political discourse. Jasmine Crockett had shown that preparation, authenticity, and strategic thinking could overcome traditional advantages like seniority and institutional position. For Tim Scott, the exchange served as a harsh reminder that political attacks could backfire spectacularly when poorly planned and executed. His attempt to diminish Crockett had instead elevated her while diminishing himself. But perhaps most importantly, the exchange showed that American politics was changing. The old rules about deference to seniority and polite discourse were giving way to a more direct, more authentic form of political communication that resonated with voters tired of political games and empty rhetoric. As one Democratic strategist put it, Jasmine Crockett didn't just win that exchanges, he showed us what the future of Democratic politics looks like. Prepared, passionate, and unafraid to fight back. The story of Tim Scott's attack on Jasmine Crockett and her epic response will be remembered as a defining moment in modern American politics, moment when preparation met opportunity, and the underdog delivered a knockout punch that left her opponent speechless and the nation talking. If you enjoyed this incredible political showdown, make sure to like this video and subscribe to never miss these amazing moments. What did you think of Jasmine Crockett's response? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to share this with anyone who needs to see how to handle political bullies. Hit that notification bell so you're the first to know when we drop our next explosive political story. This story proves that in politics, preparation beats position every single time. When you come for someone, you better make sure you've done your homework first, because if you haven't, you might just get the education of a lifetime on live television. Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend herself that day. She showed the entire country what real political leadership looks like in the 21st century. The exchange also serves as a perfect reminder that in our social media age, every political moment can become a defining moment. One well-prepared response can change careers, shift narratives, and inspire millions of people who are tired of seeing bullies get away with their tactics. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up and fight back with facts, preparation, and the courage to speak truth to power.